I think it's a complete and total mess, and I think it's really kind of an indication of the entire mess of the entire landscape, because it's really a situation where there are really just several entities involved that you can point to and say they screwed up here, or they made this so much worse, or they didn't do their jobs here.
Be the story. Imagine if every play on the field was completely and fiercely competed for in the courtroom, just like they're on the field. Today, we're diving deep with Sam Ehrlich, a legal scholar and Eagle from Boise State, a former sports agent who's at the forefront of the biggest showdowns shaping the future of sports. From high-stakes NIL battles to groundbreaking court decisions, find out how the gravel is redefining the game of sports nationwide. Hi, I'm Jay Hicks, joined alongside my co-host, Keith Miller. Keith, welcome to the show.
Hello, everybody. Excited for today's deep dive in this guest. Oh, yeah, let's go.
All right, we have a formal introduction, but you know what, Sam? Welcome to the show.
Happy to be here. Real pleased you guys invited me. Excited to talk some sports law and everything. Certainly no shortage of things to talk about right now.
We're going to dive right into it. I'm really excited. Have to say again, we were talking before this. We had a list of 100 dream guests. Your name was on it. So let's go. All right. Have to talk about this. The big news right now. Everyone knows what it is. 4 letters that mean one word, UNLV. But before we get to that, in today's episode, we have a very special guest with us today. He is a heavyweight in sports law, Sam Ehrlich from Boise State. He's not just an academic. He's a former sports agent. If you follow him on Twitter, he is a great follow. He has a keen eye for the legal battles shaping the sports world. Sam, formally, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. Really, really happy to be here. And you're far too kind. I mean, hearing that I was on any kind of list of even like top 1,000 of potential guests, it was very flattering. But top 100, that's awesome.
Well, we're excited. This is a show Keith and I worked on for a long time to bring it, and we're excited to have you here. And as we get started, I have to say, this is a Hicks Sports and Entertainment original.
And we're proud to have the support of Influxer. Influxer, NIL company that is working with about 415 universities on their NIL co-branded merchandise, marketplace, consulting, education, you name it. Glad to have Influxer on board and supporting the show.
Yeah, it's exciting. It helps make this happen. They're great partners. And you guys know I love apps, and a lot of the things that they have for student athletes in schools are app-based. So I think it's an incredible opportunity. So as we dive, we got to kick things off. We talked about it. We alluded to it before. We know UNLV is the center of all discussions. Your Twitter feed and my Twitter feeds have been going crazy. Sam, let's talk about it. The drama unfolding at UNLV has the NIL name, image, and likeness under the microscope, right? The former quarterback, Matthew, is it Saluka? If I apologize.
I think it's Saluka.
Saluka, thank you. Matthew Saluka walks away from a disputed $100,000 deal, leaving a cloud of controversy around pay for play, accusations, broken promises. It reads like a reality TV show, but it's our new reality. How does the saga, from your opinion, not only reflect the current state of NIL negotiations, but possibly setting a precedent over future dealings between athletes and universities? Where do we draw the line between legitimate incentives and outright inducements in the wild, wild west of college sports endorsements?
I think it's an absolute mess. I think it's a complete and total mess. And I think it's really kind of an indication of the entire mess of the entire landscape, because it's really a situation where there are really just several entities involved that have, you can point to and say they screwed up here, or they made this so much worse, or they didn't do their jobs here. Even leaving out the athlete who, a college student, maybe this college student should know to always get contracts in writing, but he also had an agent who may or may not have dropped the ball here. I mean, I think the facts are a little bit disputed here.
So it sounds like there's a lot of questions you're saying.
Yeah, there's so many questions that still remain with here, and I think a lot of things that are just never going to get answered because you have all these different perspectives on here, and nobody's going to be able to travel back in time and see exactly what happened. But we have this assistant coach who apparently, and given everything you hear, you have to fully believe it, offered this athlete $100,000 to transfer, and I mean the athlete did transfer, so I think there was probably some truth to that. And you have UNLV and their collective, who apparently were never told about this, or at least chose to consciously ignore it. And then you have the NCAA, which their rules are just making a complete muck of the situation.
Right.
Just the lack of, and I'm not even going to say the lack of enforcement, because they can't enforce anything. They just don't have the power to enforce everything. But everything they're doing to try to enforce it in kind of this haphazard way is just making everything so much worse.
So let me ask you, Sam, real quick. What could happen to have helped this not to occur?
So we have an injunction in Tennessee involving several different states that really allows for athletes, allows for collectives to make deals ahead of time, to make deals before enrollment. And it makes sense to be able to do that. If you're going to have NIL promises, if you're going to have this thing that is clearly happening, whether the NCAA likes it or not, you want them to be able to get it in writing. You want them to be able to feel comfortable getting it in writing. And the agent, Sluka's agent here, went on the record and said, I didn't get it in writing because the NCAA doesn't allow it. First of all, whether that's true or not.
What did you think when you read that? What did you think?
I thought
my head
insane.
When I was reading it, my Twitter feed, my head exploded.
I thought it was insane. I thought it was crazy. First of all, whether this injunction, actually affected this kind of thing. I mean, reasonable minds can differ on it. It's kind of a weird situation, and maybe even with the injunction, the agent just didn't feel comfortable doing it, or maybe UNLV's collective didn't feel comfortable with doing it. But for me, that's already a red flag. That's already something where maybe you need to evaluate this and say, maybe this isn't. Maybe this isn't a done deal. Maybe this isn't something that we can rely on. But also, once the NCAA got this injunction, or even before that, I mean, it never should have even gotten to the point of having a federal injunction, because if you're going to have these deals, and if you're going to have them pre-enrollment, I mean, whether they're inducements or not, just the idea of coming in and being able to say, because NIL is clearly tied around recruiting or not, whether it's an inducement or not, and that term is so kind of crazy at this point. It's going to happen. You're going to have these conversations. It's important to have these conversations before enrollment. Why not allow them to get in writing? Why not allow them to be able to protect themselves?
Quick question. What about people who are at home, parents who are looking at this and they're like, oh my goodness, right? We thought the school was going to do X, Y, Z. What can they learn from this?
I think it's a valuable lesson. I think it's a lesson to always get in writing. And if they're not willing to get in writing, if they're not willing to put in writing for you, that's a red flag. That's something that that's a situation that you should probably try to avoid.
Sam, say that again.
It's a red flag. It is a situation that you want to avoid. If they're not willing to put in writing, yes, legally speaking, oral contracts may be enforceable, but it's really hard to enforce them.
Right. So I want to hit the rewind button just a little bit, because we've already mentioned the Tennessee, Virginia cases that are out there and how they kind of come into play here just a little bit. Can you kind of, for our listeners, can you describe what those cases are about? Because I think that gives us a good footing here into this area.
Sure. So the Tennessee and Virginia case out in Tennessee, Judge Corker, it's a situation where, the University of Tennessee was being investigated by the NCAA for having conversations with their recruits about NIL before enrollment and offering deals and really setting up deals, setting up kind of conversations between their collective and these athletes, these recruits, before enrollment. And the NCAA doesn't like that. They feel like these conversations lead to inducements. They lead to kind of money driving the recruiting conversation instead of anything else. And they were investigating Tennessee for potential violations for that. So the Tennessee and Virginia attorneys general took them to court, and the judge ruled that, at least for purposes of a preliminary injunction, that this rule would violate antitrust law.
Perfect. Yeah.
And what does that mean to the average sports fan?
So what it means for the average sports fan is that the NCAA is just simply not allowed to kind of enforce these rules, to enforce these pre-enrollment NIL conversation rules, because it's something that is anti-competitive. It's something that violates this field of law that the NCAA has just gotten beat up time and time again over the past 3-4 years. And another kind of indication that the NCAA's amateurism scheme right now is just not defensible in court.
Man, that's amazing. And, on the show, we always talk to student athletes like, this is the greatest time to start building your brand, right? We talk about the social side, which is it is connected to NIL, but it's also them telling their story. And so now with this opportunity to be able to talk about, these deals prior to high school, I think it makes these, building your brand so much more important, because you can get started and not wait to get to college to build your brand. So I that's what I hear as a marketing person, as a branding person. And I'm so glad we have you here to help us get through all this legal, you and Keith, of course, being the legal eagle minds here. But I wanted to talk to you about this. Where do you see things, right, over the next 5 years going? Like we know where we are right now. Where do you see this in 5 years?
It's hard to say. It's really, really hard to say. In fact, usually my classic kind of cop out language here for where do I see the landscape going in 5 years is simply, I don't know. There's so many things that are in flux right now. There are so many questions that exist right now. There's so many court cases that could change things, and there's always the kind of the cloud over the head here, the prospect of congressional involvement, or maybe the NCAA can convince Congress to step in here to at least do something about this. And even with the House settlement, which I think a lot of people feel like,
break the House
years ago
settlement down for us, will you?
Sure. So the House settlement is this settlement of 3 different antitrust cases: House v. NCAA, Hubbard v. NCAA, and Carter v. NCAA. And what it does, beyond providing legal monetary damages to athletes who were not allowed to profit off their name and likeness, between 2016 and 2021. But aside from doing that, it also really, through the kind of the injunctive relief, really serves to essentially rewrite college sports governance in several different ways, including kind of the highlights here. One, it establishes the ability for universities and colleges to be able to pay athletes directly for broadcast NIL, give them money in exchange for their NIL rights to a certain degree, up to 20% of the average revenue for Power 4 universities, which is right now about $22 million. Second, it replaces scholarship caps with roster limits, essentially allowing schools to provide a lot more scholarships up to that roster limit.
Okay, so break that down, that part. But the reason why is, think about people at home, right? They're college coaches out recruiting right now, right? They're recruiting. And this is in limbo. Like, break that down for us.
Sure. Yeah. So the scholarship limit, the roster limit thing. Before, you could have, for example, a volleyball team could have up to, I think it's 15 or 16 athletes, but they could only have, I think 3 or 4, and my numbers may be off here. I'm kind of just going off the top of my head. They could only have 3 or 4 scholarships. They couldn't give they could only give full scholarships to a certain amount of athletes and partial scholarships, and kind of, divvy around that way. But not everyone on the team could get scholarships. Now you have roster limits, which are going to shift a little bit, but the scholarship limits are gone, so that schools can offer scholarships up to the roster limit, to offer it to everyone on the team instead of just a certain number on those individual teams. So that's a big part of this as well.
And those could be seismic changes coming.
They could. That's a lot of new scholarships that are added, especially to women's and Olympic sports, which could be really, really great. And then the third
question, of course, how to fund that, right?
Yeah. The funding part is always going to be a challenge for a lot of universities. I think the smart ones already have a plan in place. They already are thinking about this, even with the kind of the questionable nature of the House settlement right now. I fully imagine that even if the House settlement is rejected by Judge Wolkin in the Northern District of California, I think the NCAA is probably going to make some of these changes on their own to the extent that they can without violating antitrust law. And as such, a lot of these changes are going to happen anyway.
Yeah. Question. I want you to comment on this, right? On Twitter, you were talking about this. Charlie Barker, the NCAA president, took to Twitter, right? And I'm going to read this. We'll put this on the screen for everyone to see. But he says, we continue to see evidence of dysfunction in today's NIL environment, including examples of promises made but not kept to student athletes. Just as everyone owns stocks or buys a house, is afforded basic consumer protections, it's clear the student athletes entering NIL contracts should be too. That's exactly why we should provide student athletes with a template contract and recommended fair terms through our NIL Assist platform. He goes on to talk about congressional involvement with national NIL guidelines. Thoughts? What do you think?
I think the best response to this actually wasn't even. I'm not even going to point to my response here and say that my response was the best response to this. I saw this morning Chris Carlson, who's a beat writer for Syracuse University, had this incredible response to this. I'm looking on my other screen. If I'm looking the other way.
Yeah, please do. Go ahead and pull it up.
Yeah. He said the problem for the NCAA is that for decades, their method of protecting people from making a bad deal on buying a house was to ban people from buying houses. And I think that's perfect. It's a perfect summation here of we have this, Baker is in, and a lot of this isn't Charlie Baker's fault. He came to the NCAA in a very tumultuous time. He's trying to satisfy the needs of college presidents who I think by and large just don't get it and don't get the situation the NCAA is in right now, and feel like things can go back to the way they were before, and they just can't. But the NCAA, they've built up this reputation. They've built up, everyone sees them as the ones who are going to, like, their priority here is amateurs. And their priority here is protecting amateurs. It doesn't feel like, it's never felt like their priority is actually to protect these athletes. So my issue with this is this call for congressional intervention here. It's all about trust. It's all about, do you trust the NCAA? Or whatever entity is created, if a new entity is going to be created, largely probably with NCAA actors controlling it, do you trust the NCAA to actually make decisions, to actually enact new governance that would actually be to the benefit of college athletes instead of just restricting their earnings and restricting their ability to make a living? And I just don't buy it.
Mm. It's interesting too, right? I mean, for full transparency, Barker, former governor of Massachusetts, right? Former CEO, a lot of connections in Washington. So, there's a lot to read into that tweet.
Yeah, no, there really is. I mean, it was clear. It was really obvious the moment he was hired, the moment he was brought on as the NCAA president, that Governor Baker was there as, I can't remember who put this. It might've been Darren Heitner who kind of coined this. The lobbyist in chief. Like, he is there to get congressional intervention here.
Yeah. Interesting stuff. Good takes on all of this. And, kind of backing the train up just a little bit. We've touched a little bit on the financials. I know we know a lot of the money is coming through collectives, but obviously there's a lot of other deals that are coming outside of the collectives, and I've seen some resistance on people willing to have the contracts go through a national database too. Hoping that how do you see that part of all this evolving?
Again, I think a national database, I think a clearinghouse, in theory, is a really good idea. In theory, is something that could be helpful, so that you're seeing, so you have someone impartial to be able to say, hey, this deal that you just signed, or this deal that you're looking to sign here, there's some major problems with it. Like, there's this in the contract, there's all these different things. My issue with it, it again goes back to the issue of trust. It's not necessarily whether the NCAA has this information; it's what they're going to do with this information. And all indication is they want to, and really, when you bring this back to the House settlement, what they want to do with these deals is to make sure that they are for fair market value, and to make sure that they are, for a valid business purpose. Both of which are incredibly broad and subjective terms that I think really, again, only really serves to kind of clamp down on athlete compensation. And it's something where if that's going to be the purpose of this clearinghouse, the clearinghouse shouldn't exist. If the clearinghouse is there to actually for kind of this consumer protection kind of goal to actually make sure that these athletes aren't being kind of screwed on these contracts, then I'm all for it. But maybe that's something that should be done by a players union instead of by the NCAA.
That's a good point. That's a strong take. That is a strong take. And don't forget, listeners, for all the athletes tuning in, grab our free NIL checklist from brand&athlete.com/playbook. It's packed with strategies to help you navigate your NIL journey. It's closely tied to what we're discussing today, which is having contracts and building your team. And it's a great starting point. And we have two legal eagles on the conversation today who can really speak to that, because the top story for this week has been the lack of a contract. So if that's not the biggest plug ever for the NIL checklist, I don't know what to say. As we talk about the NIL, we talk about collectives, and we talk about this shifting, environment that we're in with revenues and share with athletes. We have to talk about the conference realignment, things that are going on, and not getting too specific because, you're sitting there with the Boise State shirt on and probably, we know where your allegiance lies, a professor there. But talk about its impact on the shifts that we're seeing in the Mountain West. We'll get to other conferences in a second, but how much play does that have?
I think right now it's just a lot of palace intrigue. I think right now it's a lot of kind of shifting of power, consolidation of power to a certain extent. The idea of, the Power 5 turning into the Power 4, turning into the Power 2. And I think right now there's a big concern about FBS, the bowl subdivision splitting up into two, with kind of the power conferences and the non-power conferences, the group of 5 conferences or whatever you want to call them.
Right.
And schools are fairly wondering, and they're fairly concerned about what side of the line they're going to be drawn on, because I think there's a lot of schools who are kind of classified in the media, classified just by their conference affiliation as group of 5 schools, kind of in the lower tier, who want to be in that upper tier, who want to be able to compete in that upper tier, who want to be able to compete in the CFB, in the college football playoff. And if we're getting to this, because everything brings, kind of comes back to this, to be able to get the fruits of that, the fruits of that privilege, the money that comes with it, the exceeding amount of money that is involved with the CFP and with big money college sports. And right now, the SEC and the Big Ten really kind of hold the cards on that. They hold the keys to the kingdom with all this. It seems like, because they seem to be kind of working behind the scenes to, again, consolidate. Bring in the schools that they want to bring in with kind of, maybe this conspiratorial, but maybe with the eyes of eventually kind of breaking off and kind of having their own thing. I think there's a lot of signs that are pointing to that. And there's a lot of schools who want to kind of create or be in conferences that are going to be on that side of the line, or at least have a fair shot of being on that side of the line, of being a fair shot of being considered as part of within that. So that's where I think a lot of this realignment's happening.
If you were a college president, right, an athletic director, and not talking about a particular school, we're talking just generic strategy, what would your strategy be with all of these shifts going on?
I think right now you have to make a choice. I think right now there's going to be a dividing line, and not even necessarily the power conference versus non-power conference dividing line, but I'm thinking more the employment versus non-employment line, because I think eventually, what we're seeing, and the Third Circuit's opinion in the Johnson v. NCAA Fair Labor Standards Act case made this clear, there's going to be a decision to be made, whether it be in the courts or whether it be voluntarily by the schools, which athletes should be considered employees and should be considered and should be given pay for their play, and which athletes should not. And if you're a school that doesn't want to deal with that, if you're a school that doesn't want to, have to deal with employment benefits and collective bargaining and all the things that happen with employment, either you have to pray for congressional involvement, which doesn't seem likely right now, or you need to position yourself in a way that it's not going to affect you. And that means kind of dropping down. And that means really deprioritizing your sports, because a big thing that the Johnson opinion picked at as kind of part of this dividing line is this idea of, what everyone likes to refer to as the front porch of the university. if you consider athletics to be the front porch of your university, you consider your athletes to be employees. That's my take on it, and seems to be the third circuit's take on it as well.
All right, Sam, quick question just on the conference realignment. We're seeing a lot of different shift, and quite honestly, from where I'm sitting, just seeing a lot of different thinking strategy when it comes to how the conferences, think about their conference realignment, how they go about, keeping their current schools on board, which, this is all about NIL and college sports right now is all about recruiting, not just recruiting your new members, but re-recruiting who you currently have. This goes for coaches who are recruiting their current roster, also going out recruiting the transfer portal and recruiting high schools. But I think the same kind of thought comes to mind when we're talking about conference memberships. You have to recruit new members. That's just where we're at. But you also have to re-recruit your current members. A pat on the back, say, hey, this is the place to be. So you're specifically, you're seeing a lot of this stuff in the Mountain West right now. And, love to get your take on just kind of how you're seeing some of these conferences approach the re-recruiting of their schools.
Yeah, and the whole Mountain West Pac-12 kind of controversy here, without getting too much into it, considering, kind of the fact that my employer is kind of in the middle of a lot of it. But it's a really interesting kind of situation right now, because clearly we have the Pac-12 that kind of wants to build kind of the best of the rest kind of mentality. They're still, the idea is, the original idea at least, and maybe this is something that could be revisited, is to bring in not just the best of the Mountain West, but also the best of the AAC as well, with Memphis, Tulane, UTSA, and USF. And the Mountain West clearly wants to stay as they are as well. They want to kind of stay as a league. They don't necessarily want to kind of fade away in the distance with the remaining schools kind of scattering into the wind. So I think Gloria Navarez, the commissioner, has done a really good job of kind of making sure that the schools that remain, the schools that haven't been already kind of swooped up by the Pac-12, stick together and kind of looking, being creative in trying to get new membership in order to get up to that magic 8 number. But really, again, staying consistent, staying as they are to keep UNLV and Air Force. And I think it's creative. It's incredibly creative to use the exit fees as kind of that kind of carrot right now. Whether it's the best long-term play, maybe not. But for a school like UNLV, which you can kind of combine two stories here and maybe come to a conclusion that maybe money is a little bit of an issue here for them. Maybe short-term money is a little bit of an issue here right now. And obviously, they're not directly going to be paying SLUCA, but I mean, there might be some correlation there between the money that SLUCA wasn't able to get and maybe some donations that they're getting, some problems they're getting in donations. Don't want to speculate too much on that, but clearly short-term capital was a priority for them, and they got a lot of it from the Mountain West. They're getting a lot of it from the Mountain West, and I think it's a good move for them if that's what they feel like is necessary.
And let's talk about this for them, because they're not the only one, right? There's a school in the 305 area code that also had a recent issue, right, of a similar situation. Let's talk about those deals. Right now, they're super huge. If you look at on3.com and look at their estimates that they have a great algorithm that talks about it. You see Shedeur, Sanders, and folks with $3, $4, $5, $6 million evaluations. Do you see that being the case in 5 years from now? Because I ask you about that because when we look at where the money's divided, right, I think around 45% of most budgets go to coaches, athletic administrators, and people like that. I think just the scholarships and things along that line for student athletes are around 9% of total budget. Do you see these deals being that high? I mean, do we see the day of the $1 million quarterback, which is what we're seeing now? Do we think that that's going to continue in 5 years? I mean, is this sustainable? And I ask this because some of these universities are just cannibalizing, I would assume, I don't know this for a fact, they're cannibalizing their donors, right? There's only so much money to go around.
I think it's going to be something that's interesting to follow. And I don't know if I necessarily have a clear answer on that, just because it really is going to be dependent on, for one, the House settlement. If you have this $22 million cap, or roughly $22 million increasing over the next 10 years cap, because you may not be able to pay one player $1 million out of that cap and still be able to afford it. And it's also going to come down to schools' priorities. Like maybe they do feel like if they have the full $22 million to spend, which I don't think there's going to be a lot of schools that put in the full cap amount, but maybe they're prioritizing here. They want to give $5 million of that $22 million to a quarterback and then kind of spread the rest out. That's something that NFL teams have to deal with every day when they're making cap calculations. But also, we don't know if that cap's even going to exist. We don't know whether that's going to actually be a thing, because at this point, there's still significant questions about whether the House settlement's going to be approved. And then even if it is, whether that $22 million is actually legal, is it something that's actually going to be sustainable from a legal perspective? Is it something that's going to be tied into eventual collective bargaining agreement if that ever happens? And then there's also Title IX questions about whether that $22 million does have to be divided equally between men's and women's sports, which we just don't have an answer to right now.
Right. I'm going to go off the reservation just a little bit here, Jay. All right. This is going to be a hot take.
Oh boy.
Yeah. Okay. Well, you know my past, you know the schools that I've been at. And so as I saw the news break last week, I was like, oh boy, should I be waiting for a deposition notice here? So Sam, I was at USC for a number of years, specifically during the Reggie Bush times. And so as I saw the news, he was filing suit to get some back NIL compensation, and I'm thinking in the back of my head, you got the NC State basketball team that was great back in the day, where they're trying to get some of that back compensation pay. So, so I'm of course I'm naturally, and I've been on the road, so I'm thinking, okay, well, let's see if I get that subpoena notice here, let's or that deposition notice here, and and in my mind, I'm thinking, okay, what can really be accomplished right now with all the former student athletes that are out there? And have we just hit the tip of the iceberg where we see the NC State men's basketball team and, Reggie Bush come out, who's next, type of thing. And, so, I've of course got my thoughts here, but I love being in the company of another sports legal scholar here, and love to get your take. And, Jay, this is going to be a hot take because I haven't done any other interviews on the Reggie Bush stuff. So
let's go.
Yeah, those lawsuits are fascinating, and especially fascinating part of it is that they're growing. The Reggie Bush one obviously made headlines, but before that, you had the Denard Robinson case out of Michigan, which largely the same theories. Before that, you had NC State. I mean, you now have 4 of these lawsuits in 4 different courts, where they get consolidated into one big one. We'll have to see whether they exist. We'll have to see, because I think it's interesting because the scope of the House settlement, the scope of House and these cases in general, limited to 2016, and this is really going to be targeting before 2016. And for those, for those kind of not aware of kind of why that 2016 date was picked for House, antitrust law has what we in the law world call a statute of limitations, where you can't file a lawsuit. You can only file a lawsuit for a certain period of time after the actual dispute happens, after the actual harm happens. At a certain point, it gets stale. It gets something where you have to you just have to file the lawsuit within a certain period of time. And the statute of limitations for antitrust law is 4 years. So doing the math, the House lawsuit was filed in 2020. So going back to 2016 kind of made sense for those plaintiffs. But now we have kind of these statute of limitations questions with the pre-2016 classes, and the idea that can they actually show, because what the way they're going to be trying to get around this, the way they're going to be trying to get around the statute of limitations problem is that there's continuing harm, that they continue to be harmed every time they have a highlight of their performance shown on screen. It's going to be a difficult kind of road to get around that. It's going to be a difficult hurdle to climb for them, I think. But
what do you mean by a difficult hurdle? Do you mean for the student athletes, former student athletes?
Yeah, for the former athletes, for sure. for those who are trying to claim this continuing harm.
And why do you think that is?
It's just going to be a question of whether the actual harm suffered by the lawsuit was when they were originally restricted from earning NIL income, when they were originally restricted, when they originally signed their national letter of intent that said you are not allowed to get money off of NIL, or is it every time a highlight's played and they're not getting paid for it? And I'm not sure how to answer that question.
It's so much in the air. I think about this tweet that went out, obviously, being a former student athlete at Baylor University and working there. And I remember this tweet that the university had put out that when RG3 or Robert Griffin III won the Heisman, the university put out a graphic that said that it resulted in $500 million in revenue to them and increased enrollment.
Yeah, you can definitely understand why these athletes are upset, and you can definitely understand why they, now that they see the House settlement, now that they see success for more current athletes in this area, you can definitely see why they feel like, okay, now is their opportunity. Now we have this opportunity here because we didn't before. There wasn't a path to success before. It wasn't a situation where we felt like we could win before. But now you see the NCAA losing all of these cases, losing all of these antitrust lawsuits. There's an opportunity there if they can get around the statute of limitations question.
I have a question. Have you seen an organization or a company lose this many back-to-back law cases?
No. Simple answer. No. It's crazy. Ever since the Alston decision, the Supreme Court decision back in 2021, it was like a light switch flipping. It was all of a sudden, the NCAA had lost a couple here and there, most notably the O'Bannon lawsuit, a few years prior. But once the Alston decision came out, once the Supreme Court ruled 9-0 that the NCAA was not exempt from antitrust law, that the NCAA cannot enjoy kind of this special privilege of amateurism when it comes to defending these cases, the light switch flipped and the NCAA was in big trouble. And I think, while the Alston decision itself, a lot of people were saying, oh, it's a very narrow lawsuit. It's only applied to educational benefits, these very particular things. I think those who really read the opinion could see this coming and could see it coming where there's going to be a lot of significant liability for the NCAA moving forward. And that's exactly what we've seen.
Right. No, that's an excellent way to put a summary to all this. I get asked that question a lot, like, where did this all start? Well, golly, it's tough to really put a nail into when did all this start. I do hear some people talk about, like, capping, salaries when we get into NIL. And then immediately I'm thinking back to the restricted earnings coach case that was decided many, many years ago. And I'm like, okay, we've got some other case precedent we have to worry about here too, that way preceded Alston that doesn't magically go away either. So it's fascinating when you do get into the case history of all these NCAA cases. And sorry if I go sports law nerd on you here, Jay, but that's what we do. We always think about these other cases that are out there, and we're thinking, yeah, that has been decided. Actually, you start thinking about that stuff. So,
yeah, I actually bring it back to 1984. I bring it back to the original NCAA Supreme Court case, this Board of Regents case, which did two very conflicting things. One, it opened up the levy significantly for drastically increased media rights earning, because before that, the NCAA controlled all college football television revenue. They really restricted it heavily, and that's what that case was about. And, the NCAA lost that case, and conferences and schools were allowed to individually get revenue from TV revenue. And, it turned from a few $100,000 a year to millions of dollars a year to, approaching $1 billion a year. In fact, the Big Ten has $1 billion a year contract, or not $1 billion a year. I think it's billion over whatever it is. But that you had at the same time you had that, as soon as you had kind of this raging river of media rights revenue kind of open up, you also had this dam built in that case, this idea of kind of this revered tradition of amateurism in college sports that courts have adhered to for 37 years, and used it to say, on one hand, that the NCAA could not restrict schools from being able to get all this media rights revenue. On the other hand, they couldn't challenge the athletes couldn't challenge the schools to get a piece of it. And as soon as that dam broke, as soon as the Supreme Court kind of looked at it again and said, you know what, this doesn't really make sense anymore. The economic circumstances here just have changed so much since 1984. There's so much more money in college sports now. It doesn't make sense to call this amateurism anymore. That broke the dam, and the NCAA has struggled to accept that new reality and struggled to adjust ever since.
Yes, as we continue talking about money, you guys know I love talking about the collectives, and I want to have a question because I do think there's high school students who are out there and they're looking. I keep talking about Shedeur just because he's at the top, and you look at what a lot of football players are earning just because they tend to be at the top as a group. I wonder what's going to happen over the next several years because the collectives appear to be from the outside completely differently run than the universities, right? Those tend to be business people who made their money, running, starting businesses, and they're very savvy on ROI, right? And a lot to do with wins. And so I'm wondering right now, as I'm looking at where we are in the schedule, been tracking some of the transfers that happened all summer long. Right. And so I wonder what's going to happen with teams that win versus teams that don't win. And how do you think that'll affect the equation? Because we are learning, but it seems like I would imagine business people are quicker maybe than the university side to make changes on the ROI.
I think it's going to have to be a really serious evaluation as to kind of the benefits of going really heavily into the transfer portal. I mean, if you look at schools like Florida State, for example, my PhD alma mater, not having the best year this year, and it's a team that was largely built on the transfer portal. I think when you're bringing together all those athletes who came from different schools, I mean, football is football. Cohesion is it's important. It's something that matters, and I think that's why you're seeing, and maybe this is anecdotal evidence. Maybe this is not. And I think that's where a lot of this is going, kind of this into this evaluation. Maybe dipping into the transfer portal that heavily isn't a good idea. Maybe retaining your athletes isn't a good idea, or is the better idea. And that might drive down these prices. That may drive down kind of the ability for athletes to be able to go into the transfer portal and get a better offer. And there's going to be, right now, the pendulum is just swinging so wildly between athlete and school, and it's especially when it comes to the transfer portal, and especially when it comes to NIL. I mean, I think when you look at the back to the Matthew Sluka situation, even beyond kind of the initial controversy of we had this $100,000 deal initially, and now he doesn't. I think the almost the more telling kind of thing about it was the university's reaction that we don't need him. We're going to move on. It wasn't that good. He wasn't that good for us anyway.
Right.
Which is just kind of crazy. If you think about it, he was the starting quarterback, but you have kind of, and I think you see this in the professional sports as well, where maybe you can replace some of these players. Maybe you can move on from these set players. Maybe the year after this, if you're a Seattle Mariners fan, the year after you lose Alex Rodriguez, you win 120 plus games.
How many Mariners fans are there out there as you go around traveling?
I live in Idaho. There's quite a few around here.
Yeah.
I went to a game, and one thing that was interesting, I had I think it was like a spicy grasshopper. It's interesting. They have a very much like I think it's popular in the southeastern part of the world, and it was amazing. And I actually did try it. Believe it or not, I tweeted about it and they retweeted me. But it was yummy.
And another quick shout out for Influxer for making this episode possible. If you're looking to connect with powerful brands or manage your NIL deals efficiently, Influxer's platform is the way to go. Visit their website and see how they can help you and your program thrive.
Yeah, we're really appreciative, helping to make this conversation happen with Sam. Someone I've really, been looking forward to for months now. So I'm just excited to dive into it and talk about it because there's so much going on. let me ask you this. As you see the next 3 to 5 years, and I keep talking about that just because I think there's so many people trying to figure out how to navigate this. What do you say to parents, right? Because we know that there might be, I know we talked about this earlier, but I think it's so crucial with the commitments. Like if you're right, because they're already recruiting, what is this, 26, 27, right? And they're looking at 28 in terms of a scouting, right? Developing who they're looking at. What should parents anticipate? Because I think it's such a changing time right now.
Yeah, and I think it's really difficult from the parents' perspective. Even not even just parents of high school athletes who are going to be recruited in the future, but I've gotten emails from parents or messages from parents who are really concerned about kind of the changes that are going to be made in the House settlement, and specifically with the roster limits. With these are parents of players who are walk-ons who have been told that they're losing their scholarships because.
Wow.
And I think the coaches are acting incredibly prematurely here. I think it's something where, if the House settlement even happens, maybe it's something where you can have some kind of sunsetting in for these new roster limits. I don't know. I mean, those are decisions to be made way above me. But I think for parents, I think it's important to follow kind of these legal proceedings. I think it's important to follow. To follow the idea of this House settlement and how it's going to change things, and really how much it's even going to change things, and whether things are even going to be all that different from right now, and more importantly, even maybe follow the employment law cases and really be able to determine whether this is going to be an employment relationship, how that's going to affect things, and decide kind of how you want decide. For your son or for your daughter to decide how they want to position themselves in this kind of very different, very kind of changing landscape. But knowing, kind of having that at the end of the day, like, these are very broad governance issues. At the end of the day, on a more local level is where I think a lot of this focus needs to be. Does your son or daughter have a roster spot? Is your son or daughter getting a scholarship, whether it be based on kind of these new scholarship limits or the old scholarship limits? And on the NIL side of things, just the idea of, where is the money going to be coming from? Is it going to be coming from a collective? Is it going to be coming from the school, where it's going to be at least a little more legitimate? And I think going back to the Sluga situation again, because it's just such an interesting case study right now. Make sure everything is in writing. Make sure everything is committed to, regardless of whether or not it may or may not violate NCAA rules, because the NCAA just does not have power to enforce that kind of thing right now.
I'm going to ask for a hot take here, because I get a lot of the calls from the parents as well, and one of the things that some of these parents are reading on social media is Title IX. And whether some sports.
Hey, let's talk about it. Let's talk about it, Keith.
What are some sports going to be Title IX casualties should the House case proceed and universities decide, what, now we're just going to drop some sports because we're going to focus on the sports that drive revenue. And so some of these parents that contact me, they're wondering, okay, if we commit to this, school House happens, are they going to drop the sport? Can they drop the sport? A lot of questions surrounding that. And certainly, like, as I talk to a lot of athletic directors, that certainly, I hear that, some of them considering that. I hear the other consideration: we're not going to drop the sport. What we're going to do is we're going to pull all the scholarship funding. That's the other consideration.
Which some sports and Olympic sports are already experiencing that, right? Like some, for example, people like on track side, for example, you might have 11.48, whatever the number is, but it's not fully funded.
Correct. So we're going to see some reaction of sorts for as a result of the House settlement. Maybe not for football, maybe not for men's basketball, but what does this mean for the wrestling team? What does this mean for the softball team? Some of those sports. So love to get your take on, like, how you see this falling out. Is it short-sighted for universities, athletic departments to, cut sports? Is that short-sighted, or, is there some sense to that?
I think the smart athletic directors, I think the smart athletic departments are going to be approaching the world after the House settlement, or the world after, whatever kind of replaces the House settlement, if the House settlement does not eventually get approved. I think the smart athletic directors, I think smart athletic departments are approaching it from the perspective that they are not going to cut sports. They are not going to cut scholarships. If anything, they're going to add scholarships. They're going to find a way to make it work. They're going to find a way to kind of rebalance the budget in a way that makes this work. Because if you look at it from a Title IX perspective, there is precedent to say that if you cut a viable women's sport, it is a Title IX violation. It is a very clear one. It's not something that, unless you can show compliance in one of the other two areas, and I think so many schools are kind of looking at the three prongs of Title IX. You're really thinking mostly about the first and the third one when you're talking.
Can I
about
jump in here?
Compliance.
Jump in real quick. Could we see cutting of men's sports? And I just ask because, like, when I was a kid, soccer used to be big. Men's volleyball used to be big back in the day.
Yeah, I think that is a stronger potential. I think it's an unfortunate potential and something that I really wish wouldn't happen. But yeah, I mean, you had the whole controversy in the past couple of decades about cutting wrestling, and there were a lot of lawsuits about that. And courts unanimously held that this is not a Title IX issue. It's something that schools are within their power to do, because Title IX is remedial legislation. It's remedial. It's designed to promote women more than it is to promote men, which, I mean, it makes sense when you think about the history of that statute. It makes sense when you think about the amount of favor that males have gotten over the years when it comes to college athletics, and still get to a very large extent. But generally speaking, I really do think that, again, the smart schools are not going to approach this from the idea of that they're going to cut scholarships. Maybe they're going to tier it where they have kind of different sports on different tiers that get, are given fewer kind of opportunities, that are given fewer kind of benefits to being the athletes here, just to kind of balance the budget a little bit. And even then, I think you're creating Title IX issues for yourself. I think you're creating issues for yourself where, like we have, I think one really interesting case to watch here is the Schroeder v. University of Oregon case that's going on in Oregon right now, because it's one where this beach volleyball team has been just consistently just abused by their athletic department. There's no better way to put it. And I know abuse is a very loaded term. Maybe that's not the right term for it, but they've had to play in this public park in a bathroom with, in this public park that has bathrooms that don't have stall doors because of all these different things. They don't have any kind of facilities on campus. They are finally getting facilities on campus a week after they filed this lawsuit, which, you can draw your own conclusions there. And what they're doing, and I think this is going to create some interesting precedent here, one way or the other, is they're not looking at comparing themselves to men's golf or to men's tennis. They're comparing themselves in the complaint really explicitly to football. And they're saying the benefits that we receive are so grossly beyond or below what football receives, where football at University of Oregon gets all these different benefits. They're chartering flights. They're getting all these different things. They have dedicated weight rooms. They have dedicated facilities, and we have none of that. And I think that's going to create an interesting thing here, because I think a lot of athletic departments want to see football removed from Title IX entirely. They want to see a world where they can balance their sports without considering the 120 athletes that make up a football team, because that makes it incredibly difficult when you have that football team that's weighing extremely heavily on the men's side of the equation.
Right.
And if you could establish, I don't know if the Schroeder case is going to establish that precedent where you can break off football entirely, but maybe you see a system where football is kind of treated is something where it's kind of spun off, or a school is, there's been a lot of talk of schools essentially just selling their own licensing.
Yeah. And I wonder too, right? We've been hearing these conversations about, football breaking out potentially, and it leads to that, right? Because it's so difficult. All the things that you just described, and the fact that football is largely the revenue generation tool, and the sports are obviously equally important. Want to also get your take, and it's on the same topic, dovetailing it here. Talk about the Big Ten women, right, who urged the NCAA to drop the regulation of the NIL collectives. What are your thoughts there?
I think they have some strong points, and I think it's something where they're speaking up at the exact perfect time, because this is something that Judge Wilkin is not happy about when we're talking about the House settlement. Because I talked about the House settlement a little bit earlier, and the one thing I left out, I wasn't able, I missed kind of getting to, was the idea that the House settlement would allow the NCAA to regulate third-party NIL a lot more closely. And they made a few changes based on, because Judge Wilkin at the initial preliminary approval hearing really objected to that. She said, you're taking rights away that already exist from these athletes. And that's something that just should not be done in a settlement. It shouldn't be done to the plaintiffs in a settlement, where you're taking away rights from them that already exist. She's saying that pay for play is already a thing, that once you have revenue sharing, pay for play is going to be even more of a thing. And I think these women, the Big Ten basketball players have a pretty strong point here. The NCAA is trying to kind of force it into kind of this framework of fair market value and valid business purpose. And the basketball players just want to see it be more of a free market consideration, where if they can get money to go to a particular school, they should be able to get that money. And not even just as necessarily an inducement thing, but the NCAA, if they have that power, they're going to be scrutinizing every NIL deal to see whether it is pay for play. And I just feel like, and clearly they feel like, that power is going to be used just far too frequently, and especially against women's sports. Because if you look at women's sports, if you look at the NCAA's history with women's sports, they've consistently and frequently and always devalued women's sports. They do not feel like women's sports necessarily have the financial value that we've seen in the past year with Caitlin Clark and Angel Reese and Camila Cardozo and all these great women's basketball players. And I think they'd look at a lot of deals that Caitlin Clark had, for example, and say, oh, well, that's not fair market value because she's a female basketball player. And that's just absolutely not true.
It's an interesting take, and I don't disagree with you, because you do look at like the administration of like the women's basketball tournament over the past few years, and that's gotten a lot of scrutiny. That's a perfect example to what you're talking about. And then I think to like the Livy Dunns of the world and stuff like that, where what kind of scrutiny is that going to get? Is that truly fair market value? But I think she's an aberration, compared to a lot of folks, where I think she does bring a lot of value. But to your point though, Sam, I think that's an excellent point. I don't want to derail us, but I do want to circle back to something real quick, because I think we've circled around it just a little bit, but just in terms of like what the NCAA's capacity is on a lot of levels here. And as we look at the House case and kind of where that goes, if House moves forward, it gets approved, I think there's heavy speculation, and especially for me, like as I visit campuses and I talk with a lot of athletic departments on a day-to-day basis, should the NCAA change the sports sponsorship requirements? And just in terms of, how many sports that for the casual fan, if you don't know, there are regulations about the number of sports that a school has to sponsor in order to maintain, Division I status, whether it be FBS or FCS, and, Division II, Division III, everybody's got their own standards, right, as to how many sports you have to fully
and
sponsor.
Even within your conference, right?
I don't think as much within the conference, but some of the conferences do have some. You must carry football, or you must carry this. But I think one of the things with the House case, as it moves forward, if it gets ultimately approved, I think that's something that's got to get looked at a little bit further as to what makes sense, for that sports sponsorship requirement. But
yeah, it's an interesting question. And I don't know if I necessarily have an opinion on it, just because I think athletic departments really need to make a choice at that point about whether they're there to have a football team or they're there to sponsor sports programs. Because if they're there to sponsor sports programs, if they're there to have a broader athletic portfolio, then they should sponsor those athletic portfolios. I think the better thing, the thing that makes better sense is for the NCAA to not necessarily change the sports sponsorship requirements, but to allow for single sports conferences where you have a conference that's just, a conference that's just based around football, similar to the Hockey East and men's hockey, where you can be in a situation where Stanford, for example, Stanford and Cal, they're shipping they're flying their football players in chartered flights all around the country, and maybe that's fine. But then they're also flying their volleyball and their softball and all that different thing, and that's what doesn't make any sense. So if you're going to have this realignment, if you're going to have kind of this strong prioritization for football, you need to be able to allow the Olympic sports and the women's and the so-called, not, I hate this term, but the so-called non-revenue sports, or non-profit bearing sports, I suppose, to be able to be more functional, to be able to be more fair to the athletes, and to really kind of more align with what those sports are supposed to be.
Right. All right. I have a hot take. This is a hot take, a question, and not necessarily my opinion, but could you possibly see maybe men filing a lawsuit about the Title IX? Here's a hot take. You haven't heard it, but here's how I did some research. In 1950, obviously we know the goal of Title IX, which has been incredible for women's sports and women in college, and that's been amazing. And the enrollment of women in college in 1950 was 11%. Today, it's done a great job, and it's 56%. Right? Could there be an opportunity? Because again, going back to when I was younger, and you could, growing up in St. Louis, which is a big soccer hotbed, there was an opportunity to go to the Valparaisos and the Butlers and all these other schools. And now, matter of fact, even at my high school, we had we had teachers who went to scholarships, went to college on scholarships for men's volleyball, right? Is that something that could be at play? Because what I see is, and we're not necessarily taking sides, but what I'm seeing is it's unlike a river dam. Think about the Pacific Northwest, and we have like this convergence of all of these. Think about like wood logs, and all of these issues are kind of coming together at once. Is that an opportunity? Because what we're seeing is sometimes while we're awarding rights somewhere, other groups, not taking my opinion because I don't have one. That's why I'm asking you guys, so that people can DM you guys with what you say. You know what I mean? But in all seriousness, is that an opportunity, or could that happen?
So you can file a lawsuit about anything. It's just a question of whether you're going to win or not. And I mentioned earlier that you had a lot of Title IX lawsuits by men's wrestlers within the past few decades, challenging the cuts to their schools on the basis of Title IX, that schools are being discriminatory in favor of women by kind of cutting their sport in favor of women's sports. And those lawsuits were entirely unsuccessful. You weren't able to establish precedent. But we are seeing in other areas of kind of similar discrimination law, you are seeing kind of a shift kind of in the other direction, where you're seeing some cases of kind of the so-called reverse discrimination be successful. I think that's kind of a newer, kind of more untested thing in the law that is still kind of feeling itself out, whether that's actually a viable claim. Because as I mentioned, I mean, these statutes, not just Title IX, but all these discrimination statutes, they're designed to be remedial. They're designed to remediate kind of a history of discrimination. But I think more practically, and I think, sticking strictly to Title IX, kind of from that perspective, I highly doubt there is a athletic department in the country at any level that favors women, that does anything to favor women, where there could be a successful lawsuit there, just because of the way that these athletic departments position themselves, and the way that, not just even with scholarships, not even just with participation. And with participation, it's important to note that the 56%, for example, that you cited, that's all based on comparing the percentage of male to female athletes versus the percentage of male to female students in the school.
Correct.
And college enrollment is largely favoring women now, so it makes sense that athletics favors women as well to a certain extent. But again, I doubt there is a athletic department in the country where you have a viable claim, just practically speaking, that men are being discriminated against.
No, I would agree, and I'm not even that old. And when I was a student athlete on scholarship, the female basketball players got one pair of shoes for the season, and they had to turn them back in.
And
Yeah,
I think
those are similar allegations in the
Yep.
Schroeder versus University of Oregon lawsuit for beach volleyball.
I think you're hitting on something really critical here, though, Jay, because I had to deal with those calculations as Sam was alluding to, comparing the general population to the participation rate in the college athletic department. I do not miss having to do those calculations, making the transition from being on campus to the NIL private field here. That is a lot of work, and so to anybody out there that is having to do those calculations, tip of the hat to you, because that is not a fun task.
Shout out to our compliance staffs across America.
It is a that you really have to get to know a lot of different subject areas. But one thing that really catches my attention is we're formulating laws right now, and based on the reality of what is today. But as you look at like a lot of the admission projections, 10 years down the road, 20 years down the road, we have a different reality that is likely what we're facing, where we're seeing a major decline in overall enrollment.
Right.
So that is coming, that is likely coming about where, perhaps universities aren't bringing in the income, 10, 20 years from now that they are today.
It's dropped, right, gentlemen? It's dropped precipitously since even COVID, right? I mean,
COVID shot things up because you all of a sudden,
okay.
You all of a sudden saw people that weren't ready to go to the workplace, but going back to school, even online enrollment, became a possibility. But even as we look at the projections, looking down the road, the drop in male participation or enrollment in college, is projected to drop, rather significantly in the future.
And I think maybe that's what I was thinking of, the drop of male enrollment since COVID. Sorry about that, gentlemen.
Yeah, no, and I think a lot of the projections we're seeing, so golly, we're
going to get complicated.
Well, and I think that's the conversation, right? Like, going back to that log jam, Sam, that's kind of what I was saying. Is like, if you read the higher ed journals, it just seems like there's just so many things coming together, a lot of different issues, some related to some unrelated, but they're still in the same river.
Yeah. No, for sure. And I think all these things are related to a certain extent, especially when you're dealing with Title IX calculations that are based on kind of the general population numbers. Now, I do think a lot of, when you look at the three prongs of Title IX, when you make these calculations largely based on substantial proportionality, which is the first one, I think most schools are leaning towards prong 3, which is a combination of athletic interests.
Sure.
But so it doesn't necessarily matter for them from the Title IX perspective as much, but maybe that shifts to a certain extent, and especially if they're able to kind of spin off football in a way where it's not calculated under Title IX, that could absolutely become a thing even more so.
Yeah, a credit to you, Sam, because you're out there on social media. You're taking a lot of these complex issues. You're making it very digestible to right. A lot of folks. One of the reasons you were on my bucket list of folks when I shared with Jay, hey, I'd like to get Sam on because I think he does a tremendous job taking these complicated issues from a variety of different spectrums, when it includes the law, and making it digestible for the regular fan. Please keep doing that, because I think you're very well appreciated and respected with your takes on these things. So I don't.
Great follow. That. Go ahead, Sam. I'm sorry.
I was just saying I appreciate that. It's very kind words, and that's really what I try to do. So I'm glad it conveys as such.
Yeah, and just a salacious plug of your social media, specifically Twitter. You're on other platforms, I'm assuming, as well as I've seen. But it's at Sam, his middle name C Ehrlich spelled out. We'll have it on the screen. It's a great follow, especially as we talked earlier. And I like to we talked a lot of philosophical, but just really being a little bit tactical, because I'm really a guy that loves execution. If you're a parent and you're navigating these things, or you're a coach, Sam is a great follow, because he's talking about these things in a way that someone like myself, the two on this video with me are legal eagles. I'm not. I was the person raising my hand saying, hey, what does this all mean? And so that makes Sam a good follow. And the second one, I think, is listen to this podcast. And we also have a weekly newsletter that goes out. It actually goes out on Sundays, and it's really practical. We have our interview, but most importantly, we have the top 3 to 5 stories of the week. I'm already stacking them. I'm following the feed. Matter of fact, Sam helps me. True story. Sam helps me figure out what the top stories are, because I love Twitter is what I call it's like a great sports bar, right? It's the conversations. It's what everyone's talking about. Sam's on there. There's other people. And so I would highly recommend go to our website, sign up for the newsletter, follow Sam, follow Keith and myself, and be involved, because this is changing so much. And I think for people who are, no matter where you are, if you're a fan, it's going to affect your university, because your universities, as you can hear, are dealing with all these issues. If you're a parent, of course, we just touched on that. And if you work in a space, because I believe, as Sam was alluding to earlier, I think budgets are going to shift. And I talked about that 45% number. We saw Texas A&M, for example, do some layoffs over the summer, getting prepared for that rep. So the only way to really stay on top of this is to stay connected, and we just really try to serve you.
Thanks, Sam, for shedding some light on some incredibly complex issues in a way that everybody can understand. Our listeners are definitely better informed because of your approach and how you talk about these things.
I appreciate it. I'm happy to be here, and especially for the parents. I mean, we keep bringing it back to the parents, because I think they're in a very difficult situation right now, and I really emphasize with them. And I approach this, like my approach to this, my kind of view of this is very kind of ivory tower, very kind of top level. I really fascinates me to learn more about kind of the more practical and think about. I always try as much as I can to bring all this down to the practical level, because that's what really matters. I mean, the NCAA governance side of it and how much legal power they have. I mean, that only matters to a certain extent. What really is going to matter is the effect on parents, the effect on athletes, the effect on athletic departments. And I keep trying to learn more with that. I'm working with my own athletic department on a lot of that as well. So I have a lot of learning to do as well.
Yep, and I love it, and I appreciate you coming on an interview and a conversation. And we hope that I'm gonna put you on the spot here, Sam. We'd love to have you back on for other opportunities, especially as things come up along the way.
Yeah, I would be happy to do it. Please feel free. I had a good time. I had a great time.
Jay, I'm just going to say, I can already feel like Sam and I could talk for hours upon hours about this stuff. But we're going to try to keep it above board and digestible for everybody here, so, yep. But I'm sure Sam and I could sit and have some coffee somewhere and probably talk for hours on this stuff. And
I want to hear more about your USC experience, because that's real interesting.
We'll talk offline on that one, Sam. Definitely.
All right, for everyone listening, keep aiming high both on and off the field. We'll see you next time at Brand&Athlete, our pick sports and entertainment. And of course, we have to talk about our sponsor, Influxer, who really makes this happen.
Yeah, we're here because of great partners like Influxer. For athletes and administrators looking to step up their NIL game, visit influxermerch.com. Sam, thanks again for joining us. You really made our day.
My pleasure, guys.
Thank you, Sam. Will you come back soon?
Of course. As long as I'm invited.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Be the story.